want to say thank you to the Radiation Research Trust as well, who I began collaborating with about a decade ago now, and who in this country are doing so much to try and move this forward. And FIRE, the group I've put together, which stands for Physicians' Health Initiative for Radiation and Environment, is part of that group. So we are part of this registered charity. But the reason I set up this kind of subgroup is to bring medical doctors and scientists specifically together. And I'm pleased to say that's to great effect. We've got some of the best scientists and doctors in the world who speak on this subject as part of this group, and I'm so proud that many of those guys are here today. I'm going to give you a super fast, rapid introduction to some of the really basic concepts, because I'll be honest, you've got some very highly academic material coming today, and I wanted to lay a bit of a foundation for that. But we are going to have time at the end for questions as well. Now, in these 10 years that I've been working specifically in this area, because my background is emergency trauma medicine, I think we've all felt frustrated. We're like, why on earth isn't this moving faster? In the medical forum especially, because it's moving quite fast in the scientific forum, but that's not being translated to medical doctors' practice and to the general population. And there are lots of different reasons why it's not, but one is perhaps that it's invisible. And most people don't think about things that are invisible. What would we see if we could see this? Because way back in the day, it would have started to come digital technology, and it may have looked something like this, we don't know. What would we see? But as it increases over time, what if we could see it? It would have become so massive in our environment now. It could obscure us seeing one another at this point. Some would say in an abstract way, it already has done that. So it's not just the intensity. The intensity of radiation has gone up by many orders of magnitude. 10 to the 18, that's a billion times higher than natural background radiation. But you can see here how in green natural background radiation dipped at around 1 gigahertz, which is the very part of the frequency that was this previous natural radio quiet zone that we've filled in with these anthropogenic or man-made frequencies. And this continues to escalate. Of course, 5G proposes that this will become higher yet again. Now, the electromagnetic spectrum is vast, and it's no secret that the ionising portion, like X-rays and gamma rays, causes damage to health through ionisation. But what you'll hear popularly, even in scientific and medical circles, is don't worry, everything else doesn't affect health. If it can't ionize, it doesn't affect health. And that's just an utter fallacy. Scientifically, that's rubbish. So you will have heard a lot about blue light in the media recently. So there's some evidence that is popularly understood already. But the truth is the whole of this spectrum can interfere with biology in multiple different ways, some very subtle, some quite dramatic. And the low-frequency fields often get missed and not discussed, but they're actually very important. These household wiring frequencies and overhead cabling frequencies, and you'll hear substantially about that today, alongside radio frequency, which we do often focus on, because those are the components that have escalated so dramatically in the last few years. Emanating from devices like this, microwave communication devices that transmit wirelessly. And so many more, they're on the market every day. And still, a lot of people don't understand that this is already classified as a Group 2B possible human carcinogen. That happened a long time ago, in 2011. But in this country especially, that was somewhat swept under the carpet in terms of the media. But that was very important what happened. And what's even more important is that the evidence for that carcinogenesis has dramatically increased since that time. Notably with 2 of the largest animal studies ever conducted, which will be discussed in great detail from people intimately involved with those studies here today, and we're so fortunate to have them here. So some fast facts for you, which we can debate more in the break times and at question time, but we're taking these as a given because they're so well evidenced now in the literature. Radio frequency radiation can damage biology at very low, what we call non-thermal intensities. There are no current guidelines here in the UK to protect health against that kind of damage. We only have these thermal heating exposures to stop cells being literally heated like they would be in a microwave oven. So the other thing that wasn't taken into account when using these IC and RP guidance was cumulative long-term effects. These were designed to only protect against very short exposures. But people are now, they're enveloped in these fields 24 hours a day. So cumulative exposures are very, very important, but not currently in our safety guidance. To complicate matters, biological disruption is not linearly proportional to either intensity or frequency of radiation. That's a commonly held misconception. Broadly, there's some truth in some of those aspects, but in terms of the proper physics of this subject, these are non-linear reactions, which means we can't predict them in the way that we would like to, or in the way that the safety guidelines have incorporated. So what happens in reality is we have these frequency and intensity windows, and this, by the way, is just from the United States Environmental Protection Agency pointing out that the guidelines we're using are not protective of health way back in 2002. But so we have these lower intensity windows where a smaller intensity can have a greater biological effect. But in addition to that, there are a whole load of other factors that make this unpredictable. You're going to hear from Dimitris Panagopoulos how polarization affects biological interaction. Natural fields are generally not polarized, whereas man-made fields are, and this is important. We've talked about cumulative exposure, the morphology of a signal. So the smooth sine waves that we began with are less irritating to biology than these very complex profiled information carrying waves. This sawtooth profiling increases biological damage. And that's very important when we're discussing 5G, because 5G is set to have these very high intensity pulses or spikes in a very short time period, making it a very complex waveform. And you'll hear more about that from numerous speakers. And in addition, in our real environment, we have interaction of lots of different layers of toxins in the environment, not just this one, but chemicals, which are often not present in a lot of the scientific studies. They're very pure in their environment. But in real life, we're all exposed to all stresses at the same time, and they can have synergistic behavior. Reflection and absorption is a serious issue, because in a room like this, you can have multiple different sources crossing over, interacting, and potentially being subject to constructive interference, where you could get hotspots that are ever changing in time and space. You can't measure those. They can be in your room or even within your body. And of course, we're not all like the routers that came off the production line. We're all different. And vulnerability depends on many different factors, including age, gender, underlying sensitivity level, and comorbidity or concurrent illness. So in terms of health effects, we know there are both acute and chronic effects. Acute effects are commonly known as electromagnetic hypersensitivity. And this is a condition that I've described like this. It's multisystemic, which is exactly what we would expect from a radiation-induced illness. It's characterized by increased sensitivity to electromagnetic fields of increasingly broader frequency ranges at lower and lower intensities. Now, we can talk about this in the discussion group. I'll be honest, I focused on this very heavily yesterday because we had a room full of doctors, really packed full of doctors. Can you raise your hand if you're a medical doctor today? So this is what we anticipated, was yesterday was a very medical conference, and today we are covering lots of different aspects of this. But my talks from yesterday will be available publicly on YouTube so that you can share them with other doctors. And we're going to, briefly I'll mention, there are lots of different symptoms of sensitivity. These are acute effects that I think a very high percentage of people in the general population are currently suffering with, but not diagnosed. So these are being treated as other medical conditions, and probably therefore somewhat inappropriately. This is a physical condition caused by EMF. But there is a problem here, because a lot of people walk into their doctor's surgery and they're told, don't worry, your headaches from your phone are because you're frightened of your phone. And they go, I love my phone. I really, really want to carry on using my phone, but I'm getting a headache. And so this makes no sense to a lot of the people being told this, and that's because it's not the correct diagnosis. The nocebo effect, which is genuinely symptoms induced by fear, that can happen. I'm not saying it's not a possible phenomenon. And it can certainly happen much later on, when people genuinely have become quite frightened of their cell phone. And they're frightened for good reason, because they've realised that it's causing them serious health effects. But it's not the cause of true EHS at the initiation of that condition. Now, it would be foolish of us to think that something that affects cells on such a basic level, and you're going to understand more about that in the next presentation, but something that is affecting cells simplistically like that is going to affect all life forms. That's what we would predict, and that is absolutely what we're seeing. So plants, birds and bees, which are particularly important right now, all of these groups can be affected. And just going back to that, you'll see that effects studies here shown in red hover at about 70%, which is something we see in many different literature reviews. This one looked at about nearly 1,000 studies. But we often see that kind of distribution, particularly if you look at non-industry funded literature. Vulnerable groups are very important, and I spoke yesterday heavily on EHS. Today I'm going to speak a lot about children and how some of the vulnerabilities of children and how we should be taking responsibility for that in the community. There are lots of other vulnerable groups, though, that we can't cover today. Pregnant women who have a level of immune suppression to carry their pregnancy, and of course the fetuses that they're carrying. The elderly, the occupationally exposed, people who are sensitive, as we've mentioned, and people with very high recreational use or body metal work that could be increasing their exposures. It's not surprising when you think about the fact that you're going to understand very shortly about these cellular effects, that those are multiple different cell types. That translates to lots of different bodily systems. So we see lots of different endpoints. And amongst these endpoints, you'll see things that are rising dramatically in the Public Health Forum. So here, we're seeing cancer, migraines, mood disturbance, insomnia. These things are rising in our children right now, and we're going to talk more about that. So I want to thank the people who initiated the EMF call, and we've got some of that group here today that can tell you more about it. But this was something we put together, which I wholeheartedly support and signed some years ago, saying we need to lower public exposure. We need safety limits that are actually reflective of the science and protecting biology. So you can imagine our dismay when instead of those lowered guidelines, we got the exact opposite in the form of 5G. So this will increase exposures. It promises to connect us from every place and even space. And in terms of the evolution of that, you know, we all know what happened here. We talked, then we wanted to send messages, then we got broad data, and this promises bigger, better, faster, more, with such low latencies that this can support things like automated vehicles. Now, there's no debate really about the sexiness of some of the innovations that this can bring, but at what cost, and that's what's important. And we make those kinds of decisions every day in our lives, and we should be making that now. So we're going to discuss a lot more about this as we move through, but to set the scene, in order to get these very low latencies, you need to be using higher frequencies. They do not penetrate very well, and in order to get them to penetrate better, they can be phase modulated in a phased array type design, which narrows the beam, and you'll hear a bit more about this. And in order to do that, because they don't go very far, you need a greater antenna distribution potentially as well. And then there's this additional provision that is even less controllable from outside. Now, all of this affects the way this will interact with biology in some ways that are quite predictable and some ways that we don't know, because the science on that particular area of the spectrum is less complete. But what's important is this is just an addition, it's not a replacement. And what we've been saying is current technology is unsafe. So we shouldn't be increasing that on any level, and certainly with stuff that we are predicting may be worse in terms of biological interaction. So in terms of what you're about to get following on, a discussion of mechanisms of action, some of the nuances of 5G, discussion of safety limits, discussion of cancer data, and we have 3 brilliant speakers covering this today. So there'll be a lot of discussion about that. Some of the political obstacles that will be introduced that are actually on a practical level really important. There's going to be a discussion of infertility by Deborah Davis, who's teleconferencing with us, we hope, if all our tech works well. And then I'm going to round off the day by talking a bit more about vulnerable groups and with a focus on children and practical ways that we can move forward in a positive way. So I'll be honest, we're sharing the problem on a large scale today, but it's very important to me that people don't feel overwhelmed by this. And we want to end on a positive note in terms of what we can do to improve this situation on a practical level.